All right, let's unpack this. Imagine a world leaving, I don't know, half of its best ideas and talent just sitting on the table.
Mm,
Especially right now with so much uncertainty swirling around us, new tech, economic shifts, geopolitical stuff, understanding and actually fixing that feels less like, well, an option and maybe more like an absolute necessity.
precisely. I mean, when you're facing really complex challenges, maximizing your potential
Yeah.
means engaging everyone fully.
Right.
Overlooking half the population isn't just, unfair. It's economically inefficient. It really limits your ability to adapt and thrive.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're taking a really deep look at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report for 2025.
Yeah.
Think of this as the definitive global scorecard on gender parity right now. It benchmarks, what, 148 economies?
That's right. 148. And it pulls data from all the major international bodies, ILO, WHO, UNESCO, UN Women, the World Bank.
And even some unique data sets, right, like from LinkedIn.
Exactly. Which gives some interesting workforce insights. And it's been published for 19 years now.
19 years. Wow.
Yeah, so it provides a really crucial trend line, where we're making progress, where we're kind of stuck.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to guide you through this massive report. We're going to try and cut through the complexity, pull out the most important data points, maybe some surprising insights, and the big picture trends you need to know to understand where the world stands on closing gender gaps today.
And the report breaks it down really nicely into 4 key areas. They call them sub-indexes. They're pretty fundamental to people's lives.
Okay, what are they?
Economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. We'll walk through each one.
Perfect. So let's jump into the big picture first. What's the global headline this year?
Okay, the top-level finding across all 148 economies is that the global gender gap is 68.8% closed.
68.8.
But, crucially, there's a constant sample of 100 economies they've tracked every single year since 2006.
Ah, okay. So that's the best way to see the actual progress over time.
Exactly. And for that group, the gap is 69.0% closed in 2025.
Okay, 69%. So for that consistent group, that's the highest score they've seen, even like above pre-pandemic level.
It is. Yeah, that's right.
That sounds like good news, doesn't it? Some definite progress.
It is progress, absolutely. For that constant sample, it's an improvement of 4.8 percentage points since 2006. But, and there's always a but.
Yeah. Here is where the headline number needs context.
Yes, exactly. The pace of change.
Right.
The report calculates the average annual progress over the 19 editions they've done.
Right.
And it's pretty glacial, 0.25 percentage points per year.
0.25% a year. Wow.
Yeah, and based on that pace, the projection for reaching global gender parity is still 123 years away.
123 years. That number, it just hits differently, doesn't it? I mean, it's one thing to see small progress year on year, but
Wow.
more than a century.
It really underscores the scale of the challenge we're talking about. It's actually a little faster than last year's estimate, which was 128 years.
Okay, so slightly better projection, but still.
But still leagues away from international goals like the SDGs, which aim for something much, much sooner.
So some progress, yes, but globally, incredibly slow. Does the report show different countries moving at different speeds? Is it uneven?
Oh, absolutely. There's a huge spectrum. Some economies are like sprinting or moving quite fast. Others are in the medium or slow lanes.
And some are just stuck.
Yeah, some are effectively at a standstill where progress has stalled or even reversed a bit. And these speeds can change for the same country year to year. It's not always a straight line.
Okay, let's break down those 4 key areas then, the sub-indexes. Which one is closest to parity right now?
The area closest is health and survival. Globally, that gap is 96.2% closed.
96.2, so pretty close.
Very close. And most economies are clustered really near full parity on this measure.
Okay, that sounds like we're almost there. But you mentioned a twist with this one earlier, something surprising.
There is, yeah. Health and survival is actually the only sub-index out of the 4 that has seen a negative evolution since the index started back in 2006.
Really? It's gone down.
Just slightly, but
Yeah.
yes. It's slipped a tiny bit over time from 96.3% then to 96.1% now in the latest report.
Huh. Why is that? I would have thought health outcomes generally would be improving globally.
Well, the report points to a specific dynamic. There have been improvements in the sex ratio at birth globally, which is good. It means less gender-biased sex selection, though it's still a worry in some places.
Right.
But those gains haven't fully offset a relative decrease in healthy life expectancy for women compared to men.
Healthy life expectancy, not just lifespan.
Exactly. Parity here isn't about living the exact same number of years. It's a ratio reflecting typical biological differences. What seems to be happening is the gap in healthy years lived is narrowing in a way that slightly pulls down this score over the long term.
Wow, okay, that's a really important nuance. It's not just about being born, but about the quality of life, the healthy years. Okay, so what's the next closest subindex after health?
That would be educational attainment. This one's very close behind health at 95.1% closed.
95.1.
And unlike health, this subindex shows a really positive trend since 2006. It's improved significantly from about 90.8% back then to 95.7% now for the constant sample.
Okay, so education is definitely moving in the right direction.
Yes, and at a much faster pace relative to the size of the gap that's left.
Mhm.
There was a modest gain this year, just 0.1 percentage points,
Mhm.
but that actually sets the timeline for closing the education gap specifically to about 17 years.
17 years. Okay, that's a stark contrast to the centuries we were just talking about.
It really is. Things like literacy rates, school enrollment at all levels, primary, secondary, tertiary, they're driving this progress. Most indicators here are already over 96% closed.
So if education is on a track measured in, decades, where are we hitting those multi-century roadblocks again?
Right, that brings us to economic participation and opportunity. This is where the gap really widens considerably. It's only 61.0% closed globally.
61%. Okay, that's a big drop from education and health. It's the second largest gap remaining.
It is, yeah, second largest.
What's the progress been like here? Has it shifted much recently?
There's been some movement, a gain of 0.4 percentage points since the 2024 report. And if you look at that constant sample since 2006, it's up a solid 5.6 percentage points.
Okay, 5.6 points since 2006. That sounds decent, but...
But because the gap started so incredibly wide, even that progress means achieving economic parity will still take you. Well, the report estimates a staggering 135 years at the current rate.
135 years. Just for the economic side. Wow. What specific factors are feeding into that huge timeline?
It's a mix of things captured by the metrics they use. Things like women's representation in the labor force. That LinkedIn data suggests women are around 41.2% of the workforce in their data set. Then there's wage equality for similar work, estimated earned income differences, and critically representation in senior leadership roles and professional or technical jobs.
So getting women into the workforce is one thing, but then equal pay and getting them into top jobs is another huge hurdle.
Exactly. The report does note a significant increase in women in senior economic leadership since 2006 for that constant sample group, up by 17.5 percentage points.
That sounds like a big jump.
It is percentage point-wise, but the overall numbers are still quite low. It just shows how far there is still to go, even with that improvement.
Okay, so economic participation is a major hurdle. What about the last one? Political empowerment. This one always seems to have the biggest gap, right?
It does, yeah. This is where the largest gap remains by far. Only 22.9% closed globally.
22.9%. Oof.
However, it's also the subindex that has seen the largest percentage point gain since 2006 for the constant sample. It's increased by 9.0 percentage points.
Okay, wait. So fastest rate of progress in terms of points gained, but starting from the absolute lowest point. That feels like a really important distinction.
Exactly. That's the paradox. And because the starting point was so incredibly low, even that relatively faster rate of gain means it will take the longest time to close. 162 years.
162 years for political parity.
Yeah. And the indicators here, they paint a really clear picture. Female head of state, nearly half the economies haven't had a woman in that top role in the last 50 years.
Really? Half?
Almost half. Only Bangladesh and Iceland have actually achieved parity on that specific measure over that period, meaning a woman led for roughly as long as men did.
Wow. Okay, what about ministers?
Ministerial positions.
Parity.
Parity, meaning 50% or more women, has only been reached in 5 European economies and 2 in Latin America. And on the flip side, 5 countries still have all-male cabinets.
All male in 2025 and parliament.
Parity in parliamentary seats. So 50% women in the legislature, that's only found in 4 economies globally.
Just 4. It's just 4. And at the other extreme, Oman is noted as the only country without any women in its national parliament this year.
Okay, so huge variation there. But there has been some improvement since 2006 overall.
Yes, definitely. For that constant sample, there have been notable improvements in women's representation in governing cabinets. That's up 12.6 percentage points since 2006. And in legislative bodies, parliaments, it's up 14.7 percentage points. So there's clear movement, but the distance to parity is still just immense.
Okay, so just to summarize the subindexes quickly, health and education are closest to parity, 96% and 95% closed respectively. But health has that kind of concerning long-term slight negative trend.
Right, linked to healthy life expectancy.
And education is projected to close in, what, 17 years?
Around 17 years.
Then you have the big ones. Economic participation at 61% closed, needing 135 years. And political empowerment, way down at 23% closed, needing 162 years, even though it's technically improved the most points since 2006. That's the picture painted by the global numbers. And it's also crucial to see how this plays out differently across different regions of the world.
Right. How do the regions compare? Does the report rank them?
It does. Northern America comes out first globally this year, then Europe, then Eastern Asia and the Pacific, Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, and the Middle East and Northern Africa region is last.
Okay. And do regions tend to, like, specialize, perform better in certain areas than others?
Yeah, you definitely see different patterns. Northern America, for instance, has achieved full educational parity, 100% closed on that subindex,
Impressive.
whereas the Middle East and Northern Africa region struggles most with political empowerment. It have the lowest score globally in that particular subindex.
And like countries, the speed of closing the overall gap varies a lot by region too, right? Over time.
Absolutely, and this is really interesting. Latin America and the Caribbean is actually the fastest mover since 2006. They've gained 8.6 percentage points overall and are projecting about 57 years to regional parity at their current pace.
57 years. Okay, much better than the global average.
Much better. Europe is second overall in progress since 2006, gaining 6.3 percentage points. But, and this is a key point from this year's report, Europe made basically zero progress between the 2024 and 2025 reports.
No progress at all this year for Europe.
Pretty much flatlined, which has pushed its estimated time to parity out to 76 years.
Wow. Okay. What about other regions?
Sub-Saharan Africa is third in terms of total progress since 2006, up 5.6 percentage points. But it actually lost a bit of ground recently, seeing a small drop this year, leaving it about 107 years away from parity.
And Northern America. It ranked first overall, but how's its progress?
Interestingly, despite its high rank, Northern America has made very little progress specifically on economic parity since 2006. So high score, but slow recent progress in that key area.
That shows how the different dimensions matter. The report also uses specific country examples to show these different journeys, doesn't it?
They do, yeah. Which helps make it less abstract. Finland is a great example, they mentioned, of consistent high performance. It ranks second globally this year and just demonstrates sustained parity across multiple dimensions for a long time.
Steady leader.
Exactly. Then you have a country like, say, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Its overall score actually dropped this year,
Why is that?
primarily due to losses in education and health parity scores. But at the same time, it actually made gains in political representation.
So showing how trajectories can be complex, moving in different directions at once.
Precisely. The subindexes aren't always moving in lockstep within a single country.
Yeah.
And Vietnam is another interesting case they highlighted. It shows a general upward trend since 2006, but with some fluctuations. Particularly, its labor force participation rate is still below where it was before COVID.
Still feeling those pandemic effects.
It seems like it. And its health score also saw a decline this year, reportedly due to a worsening sex ratio at birth imbalance. So again, complex picture.
Okay, so we have the big numbers, the breakdown by area, by region, some country stories, but the report doesn't just stop there, right? It digs into why these gaps persist. What are some of the key underlying factors they identify?
Yeah, and this is really critical. A major point the report makes right up front is the sheer economic cost of these gaps. They call it a hidden but heavy tax on global growth.
A hidden tax. How does that tax manifest itself?
Well, it's through things like underutilized talent, just not using the skills and potential of half the population. It leads to lost productivity, slower innovation.
Makes sense.
And it fundamentally weakens the resilience of economies, especially in turbulent times like now. The report really frames it not just as an equity issue, but as a core economic problem.
Okay. Let's look at the workforce dynamics more closely. The report has some interesting insights here, partly using that LinkedIn data you mentioned.
Yes, exactly. One factor they highlight is sector concentration. Women are still heavily concentrated in what the report calls people-focused sectors.
Like healthcare education.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Healthcare, where women are about 58.5% of the workforce, according to the data, and education around 52.9%. Now, these sectors are vital, absolutely essential, but they often have lower average pay and maybe fewer pathways to, say, scale or significant wealth accumulation compared to other sectors,
Yes.
like oil, gas, and mining or infrastructure. In those kinds of sectors, women hold less than 20% of senior roles. So there's a real imbalance in where women are working.
So even within the workforce, there's a sort of segregation happening. And you mentioned earlier a disconnect between education and leadership. That sounds important.
It's a major inefficiency the report highlights, yeah. Globally, women are actually outperforming men in tertiary education, getting degrees, qualifications.
Right, we saw that in the education subindex progress.
Exactly. But despite that, they're significantly underrepresented in leadership roles. According to that LinkedIn data, only about 29.5% of senior managers who have tertiary education are women.
29.5%, even though they are likely more than 50% of the tertiary educated pool?
Very likely, yes.
Mhm.
It feels like a huge waste of talent and investment. Skills are being developed, women are getting educated.
But it's not translating into leadership at the top.
Precisely. And the report notes something even more striking. This gap, the difference between the proportion of women in the overall workforce and their representation in senior leadership, it actually widens as education levels increase.
Wow. So the more educated women become, the less likely they are proportionally to reach the top.
That seems to be the pattern in the data.
Okay.
It suggests a systemic failure to translate that educational achievement into economic power and decision-making roles.
What else is impacting career pathways, especially for women? What other factors come up?
Career breaks. They are a huge factor discussed in the report. The data shows women are 55.2% more likely than men to take a career break.
55% more likely. That's significant.
It is. And when they do take breaks, those breaks are significantly longer on average. About 19.6 months for women compared to 13.9 months for men.
Almost 6 months longer on average. And that's primarily driven by caregiving, right?
It's
Parenting.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Parenting responsibilities are cited as the main reason, and this ties directly into another big theme, the care economy.
Ah, childcare, elder care?
Exactly. The report really stresses that insufficient, inaccessible, or unaffordable care services are critical barriers. They force women out of the workforce or limit their ability to progress, take on more demanding roles. It calls the care economy under-averaged.
Under-averaged. What do they mean by that?
Well, despite its immense economic value, the report estimates it's worth at least 6 times the value of the global space economy, for context.
6 times the space economy. Wow.
Yeah. And despite the fact that it's quite resilient to automation, people-focused care isn't easily replaced by robots.
Yeah.
Governments and businesses aren't effectively supporting it or investing in it as a crucial piece of economic infrastructure. It's still largely treated as a private household burden.
Rather than a public good or a necessary business support.
Exactly. And that lack of investment limits overall productivity and keeps women from fully participating economically.
Okay. Is there any positive sign in the workforce data? Any hint of future improvement, maybe?
Yes, there is actually a notable generational shift mentioned. Younger women, those aged roughly 16 to 28, have a higher workforce representation rate, about 45.7% in the data set,
Compared to older women.
compared to older women aged, say, 61 to 79, where the representation is much lower, around 26.8%.
Okay, so younger generations are participating more.
Right, which suggests a potential demographic dividend in the coming years if, and it's a big if, economies can successfully retain these younger, more educated women and actually help them advance in their careers, avoiding those leaky pipelines we talked about.
Right. The potential is there, but the system needs to support it. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to political leadership again. Beyond the really low overall numbers, what other realities does the report highlight there?
Well, you see specific representation gaps, like the fact that fewer than 1/3 of parliamentary speakers globally are women. That's a key leadership role.
Yeah.
But there's also an interesting nuance they found regarding leadership roles within government bodies that are specifically focused on gender equality.
Oh, what did they find there?
They looked at parliamentary committees, or bodies that have a specific mandate for gender equality, found about 161 of them across 114 economies.
Okay.
And interestingly, women actually hold the majority of the leadership positions in those specific bodies. About 100 out of the 144 where leadership was reported are women.
Huh. That is interesting. So women are often leading the charge on the policy side of gender equality within the system.
In many regions, yes, that seems to be the pattern. Though there are regional variations, it's more balanced in Central and Eastern Asia, nearly balanced in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia.
Okay.
But the report also notes a generational gap, even here. There are relatively few younger leaders in these specific gender equality roles, particularly in low and middle income countries.
Hmm. And within government cabinets overall, where are women typically placed when they are appointed ministers? Does the report look at that?
It does. And it confirms a pattern many suspect. Women ministers are still heavily concentrated in what are sometimes seen as maybe softer portfolios.
Like health, education, social affairs.
Exactly. Gender equality ministries themselves,
Yeah.
health, family, social affairs,
Right.
they remain significantly underrepresented in key economic and security ministries.
Like economy, finance, infrastructure, defense.
Precisely. And the report makes the point that this isn't just about optics. It has real, tangible impacts on national priorities, on budget allocations, on investment decisions. Where women are placed matters.
Absolutely. Now, there was a concept you mentioned earlier that sounds really crucial, the implementation gap. Can you explain that a bit more? It draws on World Bank data, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a really critical concept identified in the report. It's basically the disconnect between law and practice.
Okay.
It's the gap between having gender equal laws, the legal frameworks written down on paper, and having the necessary infrastructure and support systems to actually enforce those laws and help people access their rights.
So things beyond just the law itself.
Right. Things like accessible justice mechanisms, specific supporting policies, budgets actually allocated to implement the laws, functional institutions to carry them out, reliable data to track progress, all that supportive framework.
So you can pass a great law saying women have equal property rights, for instance, but if the courts aren't accessible or officials aren't trained or women don't know their rights.
Precisely. The law exists, but it doesn't translate into reality. And the report finds this implementation gap is, well, near universal globally.
Near universal. Wow.
In almost every economy looked at, the supportive frameworks are lagging behind the legal frameworks.
Are there any places where the support infrastructure is actually rated higher than the laws on the books?
The report notes a few rare exceptions: Belize, Bangladesh, Canada, Jordan, and the UK. But they are careful to emphasize this. It means their supportive infrastructure scores are comparatively higher than their legal framework scores within those countries.
Ah, I see. It doesn't necessarily mean they have perfect infrastructure overall, just that it's stronger relative to their own legal score.
Exactly. It doesn't guarantee strong laws or strong infrastructure in an absolute sense, just that the particular imbalance seen almost everywhere else is reversed or absent there.
And why is closing this specific gap, the implementation gap, so critical?
Because the report stresses that the strength of these supportive frameworks correlates strongly with higher overall gender parity scores. Simply having the laws on the books isn't enough. You have to build the mechanisms to put them into practice. That seems to be fundamental for translating policy intent into real-world outcomes for women. It feels like a major bottleneck identified here.
Yeah, that sounds like a huge piece of the puzzle. Finally, the report looks at how big global economic forces might impact gender parity. What's the key takeaway regarding, say, trade fragmentation?
Well, historically, trade integration, more global trade, has generally been a positive force for women's economic participation, particularly in lower and middle-income economies.
How so?
It often created formal jobs for women in export-oriented sectors, like manufacturing or textiles. These jobs frequently came with better wages and more social safety nets compared to informal work. Plus, trade can lower costs for consumers, which benefits everyone, including women.
Okay, so trade integration was often beneficial. But now, with trends perhaps moving towards more trade fragmentation, more protectionism.
There's a significant risk. The report warns that a contraction in the global trade volumes could put jobs at risk, and women could be disproportionately affected.
Why disproportionately?
Because of that sector concentration we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
women are often concentrated in those tradable sectors that are more exposed to global trade shifts. The report actually estimates that for every 1% contraction in global trade, almost 4.5 million jobs potentially held by women globally could be at risk.
4.5 million women's jobs for just a 1% trade contraction.
Wow. And that would hit women harder in certain economies.
Yes, especially in lower income economies where women are more heavily concentrated in those tradable sectors like manufacturing and agriculture.
Hmm.
And the COVID-19 pandemic gave us a stark lesson here. Trade shocks tend to affect women's employment longer, and the recovery is often slower and harder for them, worsening existing disparities.
So the report is basically flagging this, saying, hey, as trade policies evolve globally, we need to keep these gendered impacts front and center.
Exactly. It's a crucial factor to consider in the current geoeconomic climate. Okay, this has been a really thorough deep dive into the report's findings. Thank you. Before we wrap up, maybe we could just briefly touch on the methodology again. What's the fundamental approach they take in measuring these gaps?
Sure. The core philosophy is really important for understanding the numbers. First, the index measures gaps between men and women. It doesn't measure overall levels of development.
So a rich country and a poor country can be compared on the size of their gender gap.
Precisely. It allows for a direct comparison of gender parity across very different economic contexts. Second, it measures outcomes, not inputs.
Meaning it looks at, say, the percentage of women in parliament, not just whether there's a law allowing women to run for office.
Exactly. It focuses on the results, the reality on the ground. And third, it focuses specifically on gender equality. This means it doesn't penalize economies where women might slightly outperform men in a certain area, like sometimes happens in education enrollment. Parity or 100% closed gap is the benchmark.
That focus on gaps and outcomes seems really key to cutting through other factors and seeing the specific impact of gender difference. And the diverse sources we mentioned earlier, the ILO, WHO, LinkedIn, World Bank.
Yeah, using that wide range of data from international organizations, providing those big demographic and labor stats, to unique sources like LinkedIn for career pathway insights, to the World Bank data on the legal and supportive frameworks, it all helps provide a much richer, more comprehensive snapshot of gender gaps across these really critical dimensions of life.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. Let's try and summarize the key takeaways from our deep dive today.
Okay, so the World Economic Forum's 2025 report shows us that globally we are making slow but somewhat steady progress. The overall gap for that constant sample of countries is the narrowest it's ever been, just inching above pre-pandemic levels.
But, and it's a huge but, the pace is incredibly slow. That 123 years to global parity number really highlights the immense scale of the challenge still ahead.
Right. Significant gaps remain, especially in economic participation and opportunity, 135 years to close, and political empowerment, a massive 162 years away.
Even though political empowerment saw the biggest points gained since 2006, meanwhile, education is on a much faster track, maybe 17 years. But health and survival has that concerning slight long-term negative trend, which is tied to healthy life expectancy differences.
And we've seen how the report identifies these critical underlying factors driving these gaps. There's the clear economic cost of gender inequality. There are the workforce dynamics, sector concentration, that frustrating failure to translate women's educational achievements into leadership roles.
Yeah, that education to leadership disconnect.
The huge impact of career breaks, often driven by caregiving needs and linked to that under-averaged care economy.
And that pervasive implementation gap, the difference between having laws on the books and having the real infrastructure to make them work.
Exactly. And on top of all that, the potential negative impacts of big global trends like trade fragmentation, potentially hitting women's jobs harder.
So we've tried to sift through this really extensive report to give you the essential insights, the key numbers, and the major trends they've identified this year.
And remember, as we said at the start, this isn't just abstract global data. These trends directly impact economies, they shape opportunities, they influence lives everywhere, including, your own.
Right. Understanding these complex dynamics is really essential, I think, for informed decision-making, whether you're involved in policy or business, or maybe just navigating your own community and career.
Absolutely.
So considering everything we've discussed today, the slow overall pace, these deep structural challenges like the implementation gap where laws aren't matched by support, the hurdles women face in career pathways, especially around caregiving. Here's a final thought for you to ponder. What specific action, something perhaps beyond just passing another law or setting another representation quota, do you think is the single most powerful lever we could pull to truly accelerate the pace of closing these gaps in the years ahead? What could fundamentally change those underlying dynamics we've talked about?
That's a really good question. Something to definitely think about.